The island of Saipan in the Marianas was the site of a fierce battle in June to July 1944 as US Marines and US Army soldiers struggled to capture the island from a determined Japanese garrison. It was also the location of the largest armored clash of the Pacific War, when US M4 Shermans went toe-to-toe with Japanese Type 95 and 97 tanks. Japanese armor was not highly rated in World War II. Japan's tanks were small, lightly armored and undergunned in comparison with its British and American adversaries. But in China from 1937 onwards, Japanese tanks had proved more than adequate against the Chinese army that only had a handful of German Panzer Is and other small types. Japanese tank development had been neglected as steel production was poured into the Imperial Navy and the production of artillery guns and personal weapons for the army. But nonetheless, Japanese tanks had performed well in 1941-42 against the British in Malaya and the Americans in the Philippines. In Malaya, the British had no tanks and also inadequate numbers of anti-tank guns, and in several engagements, little Japanese tanks routed British Empire forces, tipping the balance in Japan's favor, leading eventually to the capture of Singapore. In the Philippines, the Japanese encountered the US M3, itself a small, lightly armed tank with a small gun. In effect, a level armored playing field. But all this changed from the campaign in Burma, where the British deployed the American Lee and Sherman tanks, and in the Pacific, where Shermans were landed in quite large numbers to support US invasions. In this short training film, a Type 95 tank captured intact in Burma is tested by the Americans in India, revealing both its good and bad points.
This tank holds 3 men, Japanese size, and mounts a .37 caliber plus 2 .30 caliber machine guns. It has several good points. It's highly maneuverable for a quick right or left turn. And it can get along very well over ditches, trenches, and rough terrain. Notice how low the wheels go down in the ditch. If you don't want a crease in your helmet, dig your foxhole good and deep. But she's got weak points and can be made defenseless. It's vulnerable at all times. From a distance, it can be put out of commission with a rifle. Here's how. This is the rear idler and track. The wheel is held by only a single bracket. And a well-placed bullet can throw the track off the bogies by breaking this bracket, thus stopping the tank dead in its tracks. Make a note of these weak spots: the pistol ports and slits, the eyes of the tank when under fire. A splatter of machine gun fire can put out the eyes. Inside these ventilator hatches is the heart of the tank, the engine. Machine gun fire will knock it out. The ventilators are also vulnerable to close quarter attack with hand grenades and incendiaries. Under this hatch is the oiling system, fuel supply, and batteries. Extremely vulnerable at close quarters. This is the best spot to set the tank afire, an ideal target for a Molotov cocktail. The turret is hand-operated, but there's a gap between the turret and the hull, and if anything is wedged between the two parts, the turret is useless. A canteen, a rock, or your bayonet will do the trick. Ordnance tried this tank out to compare its speed with our own. The course was 4/10 of a mile. The American tank, the one furthest from the camera, quickly forges ahead and rapidly increases the lead. The finish line. Time for our tank, 50 seconds. Jap tank, 55 seconds. Our tank, 10% faster. A pretty good tank, but not so tough against the soldiers who have taken time to learn the weapons of the enemy.
As part of the US island-hopping campaign across the Pacific towards Japan, the seizure of the Marianas was of vital importance because it would enable the new B-29 Superfortress long-range bomber to be based there and within range of the Japanese home islands. Saipan in the Marianas had been a Japanese possession since 1914, when Japan, then an Allied power, had captured Saipan off the Germans, who themselves had purchased the island from the cash-strapped Spanish Empire in 1899. By 1944, Saipan formed part of the last defensive belt for the Japanese, who were determined to hold it at all costs. The Japanese 31st Army had stationed 32,000 Army and Navy personnel on Saipan, the main defense forces consisting of the 43rd Infantry Division and 47th Independent Mixed Brigade. Present on Saipan was the 3rd, 4th and 5th Companies of the 9th Tank Regiment, with the remaining companies based on Guam. Altogether, the Japanese had 31 Type 97s, 4 Type 97s improved with a better 47mm main gun, this being the only tank type the Japanese possessed with any chance of knocking out a Sherman and then only with a side hit. And, of course, there were plenty of Type 95 tanks, 12 forming a company in the 9th Tank Regiment, and in addition a further 9 serving as part of the Yokosuka 1st Special Naval Landing Force, who also had a collection of Type 2 amphibious tanks. The Americans would be using the Sherman and also the M5 Stuart. The Japanese had prepared a defense in depth. Saipan is a relatively big island, 72 square miles of flat cane fields, swamps and mountains.
Saipan was the Japs' nerve center. Its capital and largest city was Garapan, the second biggest city, Charankanoa. Airfields were at Aslito and Charankanoa, and a partially completed airstrip at Marpi Point.
On the 15th of June 1944, after 2 days of ferocious naval bombardment, the US Marines commenced their landings. Japanese resistance was heavy, around 20 amphibious Sherman tanks being knocked out, along with many LVTs.
Under our naval barrage, the boat started for Saipan's shores at 08:15 hours. Soon we would know how effective had been the pre-invasion bombardment and how much strength there was left on the island. Once on land, however, we were pinned down for a couple of hours.
By nightfall, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had occupied a shallow beachhead 6 miles wide but only half a mile deep. The Japanese therefore decided to counterattack and try to drive the Marines back into the sea. In order to do so, the Japanese launched their own amphibious assault, landing some 1,000 Japanese naval troops in battalion strength behind the lines of the 6th Marines. They stormed out of their landing craft, supported by 3 Type 2 amphibious tanks, with bugles blaring, officers with drawn swords, and accompanied by blood-curdling screams. In a tough fight, around 700 Japanese were killed in several hours of intense combat, the Japanese failing to dislodge the 6th Marines, the survivors managing to withdraw before dawn to their own lines. All 3 tanks were knocked out by US bazookas and artillery fire. However, a second assault was launched at dawn on the 16th using the Special Naval Landing Forces Type 95 Tank Company and the 97s of 4th Company, 9th Tank Regiment. The results were predictable. US artillery and mortars stripped away the supporting Japanese infantry, and US bazookas and heavy machine guns plus Sherman tank fire soon reduced the Japanese tanks to burning hulks. As the US Marines and Army troops advanced against heavy Japanese resistance, who fought from concrete and log machine gun bunkers, pillboxes, and anti-tank emplacements, the Japanese decided to launch an all-out attack. On the night of the 16th to 17th of June 1944, 44 tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment led the charge, the largest concentration of Japanese armour ever encountered by US forces in the Pacific War. The noise of so many engines alerted US Marines to the impending night assault, and immediate calls were made for armoured assistance. A platoon of M4A2 Shermans arrived, along with some M3 half-track tank destroyers armed with 75mm guns. In the very early hours of the 17th of June, the mass of Japanese armour came charging across flat cane fields towards the American positions, and into the devastating fire of Shermans, tank destroyers, Marine 37mm anti-tank guns, bazookas and heavy machine gun fire, as the darkness was brilliantly lit by US star shells. It was another turkey shoot. The Japanese bravely pressed on, a handful of tanks managing to reach the Marines' perimeter, but all were swiftly dealt with. One platoon of Type 97s became mired in a swamp, its tanks picked off one by one, while just 12 Japanese tanks managed to withdraw in good order to fight another day. Not a single American tank was knocked out during the engagement. What was left of the Japanese Army and Navy tank force were expended later in the battle. On the 24th of June, with US forces now close to completing its capture of Saipan, some of the Japanese tanks that had survived the big battle on the 17th of June were knocked out during an attack at Garapan, many knocked out by Marine M4s. The few surviving Japanese tanks were knocked out in encounters with light US Army M5A1 Stuarts. The great tank battle on Saipan was evidence not only of the obvious problem that Japanese tanks were hopelessly outgunned by US Shermans, but that they could be easily destroyed by infantry armed with bazookas and even 50 cal machine guns. But Saipan remained nonetheless a very stiff fight against entrenched Japanese forces, who also launched a massive Banzai charge towards the end of the fighting, the largest ever encountered by US forces, when over 4,000 Japanese charged Marine and Army lines. Out of an original garrison of 32,000 men, the Japanese lost 24,000 killed in action, and a further 5,000 committed suicide rather than surrender. A further 7,000 Japanese civilians on the island also died, many by suicide, along with 22,000 local civilians. US casualties were also heavy, 13,790, including 3,426 killed. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. You can also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.